Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The afternoon sun filtered lazily through the campus trees, casting long, warm shadows across the worn pathways Josephine often strolled. Her presence seemed to gather light itself, a quiet, effortless beauty that turned heads without her even trying. She was dressed simply, a modest gown hugging her slim figure, her natural hair tied into a neat puff atop her head. Students who passed her often stole second glances, but Josephine hardly noticed. She had grown used to the attention. What she had not grown used to, however, was the way Bobby stared. Not the casual admiration she could brush off. Bobby's gaze followed her like something heavy, something insistent. At first, she thought little of it. Bobby was known around campus, older, confident, and draped in the kind of effortless wealth that spoke louder than his voice ever could. Everyone knew Bobby drove the latest cars, wore watches that sparkled even under shade, and walked with the air of someone who had already conquered the world. Josephine had heard the whispers about him long before he ever spoke to her directly, and though a small part of her was flattered by his attention, a larger part felt wary, like a quiet voice telling her to be careful, though she could not yet explain why. It began innocently enough. A bouquet of flowers slipped into her locker one afternoon. A gold-plated wristwatch she never asked for, handed to her after lectures with a casual, "Just a little something for you." Then came the shopping sprees, new clothes, perfumes she had only seen in glossy magazines, gadgets she didn't even know how to use. Bobby was relentless, weaving himself into her days with a kindness that was hard to refuse. He made grand promises about her future, spoke of businesses he could open for her, hinted at how different life would be if she was by his side. Josephine listened politely, but kept her distance. She laughed with her friends when they teased her about him, pretending not to notice how Bobby's name had somehow become stitched into every conversation. Deep down, she wasn't fooled. She saw the way he brushed off waiters with a snap of his fingers, how he bragged loudly about never needing to queue like ordinary people. She watched how easily his smile turned into a frown when things didn't go his way. Pride clung to Bobby like a second skin, visible to anyone who cared to look beyond the surface. Josephine cared. She saw too much, and no matter how expensive the gifts, she could not quite ignore the chill that followed whenever she thought about being anything more than polite with him. Her friends thought differently. In hushed conversations over roasted corn and cold drinks at the school canteen, they urged her to say yes. "Josephine, think about your future. This one is not just fine, he's rich too," one of them exclaimed, eyes wide with excitement. Another chimed in, "You can't eat love, my dear. Better cry in a Mercedes than smile on a bicycle." Josephine laughed with them, but it was a hollow, uncertain sound. She tried to explain the things she noticed, the pride, the arrogance, the sense that he saw the world as something that owed him loyalty. But each time, they brushed her off, as if money could wash away character. Alone in her room at night, Josephine turned the gifts over in her hands, wondering if she was being foolish. Was it wrong to expect more? To want kindness that didn't come wrapped in luxury? The pressure grew quietly, like a slow flood seeping under her door. And so, one evening under the orange glow of the hostel's broken corridor light, when Bobby asked her, for the third time, to be his girlfriend, Josephine swallowed her doubts, smiled weakly, and said yes. The early days of their relationship unfolded like scenes from a storybook Josephine never believed she'd be part of. Bobby was generous, almost to the point of overwhelming her. Weekend getaways to luxury resorts, surprise deliveries of food and gifts, whispered promises over candlelit dinners that made her friends giddy with envy. In public, he played the perfect boyfriend, pulling out chairs, opening car doors, draping his arm protectively over her shoulder. Josephine caught herself smiling sometimes, not out of love, but out of the strange comfort that came from knowing someone wanted her so obsessively. Still, deep inside, her heart remained cautious, beating to a rhythm that reminded her this was not the fairy tale it appeared to be. Bobby was quick to demand attention. He grew visibly irritated when she took too long to reply to his messages or when she chose to spend time with her friends instead of him. Small warnings peppered their time together, a sudden tightening of his jaw when another man complimented her, a cold silence whenever she disagreed with something he said. Yet the lavish lifestyle he wrapped around her made it harder to see the dangers clearly, blurring the lines between affection and ownership in ways Josephine had never encountered before. As weeks slipped by, Josephine noticed how easily Bobby's affection morphed into anger. A misplaced joke could sour his mood for an entire evening. A forgotten goodnight text would spark long, accusatory voice notes filled with biting words that left her rattled. But somehow, he always circled back to apologies that sounded grander than the offenses, bouquets larger than her arms could hold, handwritten notes filled with dramatic declarations of how much he needed her, how no other woman could ever complete him. Josephine didn't know whether to feel cherished or trapped. Each time she thought about pulling away, Bobby would sense it, and the gifts would increase, the sweetness would double, suffocating her second thoughts beneath a flood of expensive distractions. It was during one of these dizzying cycles that Bobby mentioned, almost casually, that he intended to set up a business for her. A boutique, he said, something classy, worthy of her beauty. The idea took root in Josephine's mind faster than she cared to admit. Perhaps, she reasoned, enduring his flaws a little longer could open doors she could not unlock on her own. Maybe patience, just a few more months, could turn her sacrifices into something she could finally call hers. The decision to stay was not made all at once, but in small, silent concessions. A swallowed retort here, a forced smile there. Josephine told herself it was strategic, that she was simply playing the game until she could secure her independence. But in truth, each compromise she made carved small cracks into her spirit. Her dreams of finishing school, traveling, building a life unshackled to anyone else's temper, they all began to dim under the weight of Bobby's demands. He grew possessive in ways that no one else seemed to notice. He insisted on choosing her outfits, frowning at dresses he thought showed too much skin. He demanded to know who she was speaking to, where she was going, why she didn't sound happier to hear his voice. Josephine became a version of herself she barely recognized, quieter, smaller, more cautious with her laughter. And yet, she clung to the hope that the promised boutique, the promised freedom, was just around the corner, if only she could endure a little longer. What she didn't realize was that every day spent hoping was another thread, tying her tighter to a future she would soon come to dread. The first real fracture came on a humid Saturday evening, one that began like any other. Josephine had worn a simple blue dress, soft against her skin, and had gone out with a few classmates to celebrate the end of semester exams. It wasn't anything wild, just laughter over plates of pepper soup in a noisy, open-air restaurant near campus. But Bobby's call came halfway through the meal, his voice sharp, demanding to know why she hadn't informed him she was stepping out. Josephine tried to explain, her words fumbling over the static of the call, but it didn't matter. Bobby had already made up his mind. When she returned to her hostel later that night, she found him waiting by the gate, leaning against his car with a look in his eyes she had never seen before, cold, almost dangerous. Without a word, he grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging painfully into her skin as he dragged her towards the car. His whispers were furious, hissing accusations about men staring at her, about her disrespect. Josephine pulled free, heart hammering in her chest, but the seeds of fear had already been planted. That night, for the first time, she understood that Bobby's love had conditions she could never fully meet. In the days that followed, Bobby's possessiveness thickened into something more sinister. He began showing up unannounced, waiting outside her classes, interrogating her about every male voice he overheard during their calls. The gifts didn't stop. If anything, they grew even grander, arriving with apologies that tasted sweet but soured quickly in her mouth. Josephine found herself trapped in a cycle of emotional whiplash, showered with love one moment, crushed under suspicion the next. Worse still, whispers began to float back to her ears about Bobby's late-night escapades. Friends who had once envied her relationship now hesitated to speak, their eyes darting away whenever she entered the room. The truth unraveled in pieces. Bobby was seeing other women, openly, shamelessly, as if Josephine's loyalty was something he could demand without ever offering his own. She confronted him once, gathering every ounce of courage she had, only to be met with mocking laughter. "You should be grateful," he sneered, brushing her off like she was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The humiliation stung deeper than any slap could have, and Josephine walked away from that confrontation, knowing something inside her had cracked irreparably. But even with her heart heavy and her mind screaming to leave, Josephine hesitated. The promised business, the whispered dreams of independence, still dangled before her like a cruel bait. She told herself she would wait just a little longer, until the boutique was hers, until she had something solid to stand on. Yet with every passing day, Bobby's grip tightened. He wanted to know where she was every hour, who she was speaking to, what she was thinking. If a classmate even lingered too long near her, Bobby's temper would flare, sometimes erupting into violent shoves or harsh words spat in the privacy of his car. Josephine learned to make herself smaller, quieter, careful to avoid anything that might ignite his rage. And still, beneath the fear, a burning resentment grew, a desperate longing for freedom she no longer knew how to reach. Somewhere deep within, she realized that Bobby was not building a future with her. He was building a cage. And every day she stayed, the walls only grew higher. The first sign that something was wrong came one gray morning when Josephine struggled to get out of bed. Her body felt heavier than usual. Her head spun lightly with every movement, and a strange nausea curled in her stomach at the smell of frying plantain wafting in from a neighbor's room. She told herself it was stress, the endless tension of being under Bobby's watchful eyes, the emotional exhaustion from pretending everything was fine. But as the days passed, her symptoms refused to be ignored. Meals she once enjoyed made her gag, her appetite thinned to almost nothing, and her periods, usually so regular, had vanished without a trace. A cold, creeping fear began to settle into her bones, a whisper in the back of her mind growing louder with each passing day. Alone in her small, dim hostel room, Josephine sat curled on her bed, her hands trembling as she counted the dates on her phone's calendar. The realization hit her harder than anything Bobby had ever said or done. She was late. Too late to dismiss it as mere stress. Too late to pretend nothing had changed. Unable to bear the suffocating uncertainty, Josephine confided in her closest friend, Adeora. They sat together on a bench behind the campus chapel, their heads bent close as Josephine whispered her fears. Adeora listened in stunned silence before squeezing Josephine's hand with trembling fingers. "You have to be sure first," she said, her voice barely audible above the rustling of the trees. That afternoon, they sneaked into a small pharmacy tucked away from the main road, buying a test kit with crumpled Naira notes pooled together from their wallets. Josephine barely breathed as she waited in the cramped, dusty restroom of the pharmacy, her heart slamming against her ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. When the result appeared, clear and undeniable, Josephine's vision blurred with a rush of panic. Pregnant. The word echoed in her mind, louder than the buzz of the fluorescent light above her head. Adeora, seeing the devastation on her friend's face, pulled her into a tight hug, but Josephine remained stiff, her mind already spiraling. There was no space left for dreams, for boutiques, for freedom. This was not the life she had bargained for. That night, back in her room, Josephine sobbed quietly into her pillow. the walls closing in tighter than ever before. Her thoughts raced, wild, frantic, desperate. She needed to get rid of it, she thought. There was no way she could tie herself even closer to Bobby, no way she could bring a child into the chaos her life had become. The idea of abortion hovered in her mind like a forbidden door she had no choice but to open. Yet, even in her panic, Josephine felt the weight of consequences she barely understood. Ideora visited her the next morning, her face drawn with worry, and pleaded with her to think carefully. "At least tell Bobby first," she said gently, brushing hair from Josephine's clammy forehead. "Don't do this alone." Josephine hesitated, her instincts screaming that Bobby would want no part of fatherhood. Surely, she thought bitterly, he would seize the chance to erase this complication. With a heavy heart, she resolved to face him, certain that this one thing, at least, they would agree on. Certain that after this conversation, she could put an end to it and reclaim what little of herself remained. Josephine chose a Sunday afternoon to tell Bobby, thinking that the relaxed mood of the weekend might make him easier to approach. She met him at a quiet eatery just outside town, a place they used to visit before the darkness crept fully into their relationship. As she sat across from him, stirring her untouched drink, her palms grew clammy against the glass. Bobby, oblivious to her turmoil, scrolled lazily through his phone, smiling faintly at something she couldn't see. Josephine opened her mouth once, twice, but the words tangled themselves in her throat. Finally, she forced the confession out in a whisper so soft she wasn't sure he heard it. "I'm pregnant." Bobby's head snapped up instantly, his face unreadable. Josephine braced herself for the anger, the rejection, the accusation she had rehearsed responses for. Instead, there was only silence stretching between them, heavy and endless. And then, to her shock, Bobby leaned back in his chair, nodded slowly, and said, "Good. You'll keep it." The casualness of his response knocked the breath from her lungs. Josephine stared at him, waiting for him to laugh and say he was joking, waiting for the rage she had anticipated. But Bobby was serious. He spoke calmly, explaining that in his culture, abortion was a deep taboo, a stain on a family's honor, a curse that could follow generations. His voice carried no warmth, only the weight of something absolute, something that left no room for argument. Josephine's mouth opened in protest, but he silenced her with a wave of his hand. "There's nothing to discuss," he said sharply. "You're carrying my child. That makes you my wife." As if he had merely finalized a business deal, Bobby began talking about arrangements, dowry visits, and dates. Josephine sat frozen, her mind struggling to process the rapid shift from crisis to prison. She wanted to scream that she wasn't ready, that this wasn't the life she chose, but the words felt meaningless against the cold certainty in Bobby's voice. He had decided. And in Bobby's world, once he decided something, it was already done. By the time Josephine found her way back to her hostel that evening, the walls of her room seemed to close in tighter than ever. Ideora was waiting for her, perched anxiously at the edge of Josephine's bed. One look at her friend's pale face told her everything she needed to know. Without waiting for Josephine to speak, Ideora pulled her into a long, tight hug, whispering that everything would somehow be all right, lies, sweet and hollow, floating in the cramped air between them. Josephine didn't speak. She sat there, stiff and silent, listening to the rain begin to batter the tin roof above them. In that stormy silence, she realized that her fate had been sealed, not with her consent, but with a decision she could not undo. Marriage loomed ahead like a sentence rather than a celebration. There would be no business, no school, no second chances. Only Bobby, his controlling hands, and a future she had never wanted. Josephine felt something inside her shift then, a quiet surrender, a part of her spirit curling inward to survive what her heart already knew it could not escape. The marriage happened quickly, as though Bobby was afraid Josephine might slip through his fingers if he waited too long. There were no elaborate ceremonies, no vibrant celebrations that marked new beginnings. Instead, it was a rushed gathering at her family's modest compound, where Bobby arrived with his people carrying gifts and loud voices, speaking over Josephine's quiet hesitations. Her parents, worn down by the fear of shame and scandal, urged her to accept her new reality with forced smiles and heavy sighs. Josephine stood through it all, numb, feeling like a guest at her own life. She wore a simple dress borrowed from a cousin, her stomach still flat, but already harboring the life that tied her to Bobby in ways she had not fully understood. The day passed in a blur of handshakes, prayers muttered too quickly, and laughter that seemed too loud, too sharp against your ears. When the guests finally left and the dust of the ceremony settled, Josephine sat on the edge of her new bed in Bobby's house, a place too large, too cold, too foreign, and realized she had crossed a line she could never uncross. It didn't take long for Bobby's true nature to bloom fully behind closed doors. With the title of wife pinned to her name, he grew even more controlling, his jealousy sharper, his anger quicker to ignite. Josephine's phone was the first casualty. Bobby demanded access to every message, every call, scrutinizing even conversations with her relatives. He monitored her movements like a warden, questioning her about every errand, every neighbor she spoke to, every glance she exchanged in public. Then came the announcement that gutted her to her core. Bobby insisted she withdraw from the university immediately. He masked his command with the language of love, said he couldn't bear the thought of other men staring at what was his, that schooling was unnecessary since she would soon be busy raising their family. Josephine tried to protest, tried to reason, but Bobby's temper boiled over in a fury she had never seen before, and for the first time she realized that his love was a weapon he could wield against her without hesitation. Her books were packed away without ceremony, her dreams folded and locked in a forgotten drawer. She watched her future shrink piece by piece until all that was left was the growing child inside her and the heavy walls Bobby built around her life. Pregnancy, once imagined as a sacred and joyful thing, became just another chain. Josephine found herself isolated, her days consumed by chores and silence. The baby kicked, growing stronger as the weeks passed, but even that small miracle felt distant under the weight of her loneliness. Bobby, meanwhile, spent less time at home, his absences punctuated by rumors Josephine could no longer pretend not to hear. The perfume on his shirts that wasn't hers, the lipstick stains she hadn't left, the long hours he refused to explain, they became silent conversations Josephine had with herself in the quiet corners of their home. And when he did return, it was often in sour moods, quick to anger over meals not cooked right, clothes not ironed sharp enough, silences not soft enough. Josephine learned to tread lightly, to move like a shadow in her own home, careful never to provoke the storm that always seemed ready to break. Night after night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering how she had ended up here, how a love story written in expensive gifts had twisted into a life she barely recognized. And with every sleepless night, she began to understand that some prisons didn't have bars. Some prisons were built from promises broken in the quiet hours, when no one else was watching. The day Josephine went into labor was soaked in a heavy rain that blurred the world into shades of gray. She labored quietly at first, the pain gripping her in waves that left her breathless, but Bobby was nowhere to be found. Alone in their cold, half-lit bedroom, Josephine gritted her teeth against the sharp stabs of fear and clutched the edge of the bed frame until her knuckles whitened. It was a neighbor, Mrs. Tade, an elderly woman who heard Josephine's faint cries through the open window, who eventually rushed her to the nearest clinic. The ride there was a blur of pothole-ridden roads and whispered prayers. When Josephine finally held her son in her arms hours later, the weight of him against her chest filled her with a strange cocktail of awe and sorrow. She stared at his tiny fingers curling instinctively around hers, feeling a fierce, aching love pulse through her even as a sharp sadness settled deep into her bones. This baby, innocent and perfect, had been born into a world Josephine already regretted bringing him into. When Bobby finally arrived the next morning, smelling of stale alcohol and half-hearted apologies, Josephine simply turned her face to the wall and closed her eyes. Motherhood arrived not as a joyous transformation, but as another layer of silent duty. Josephine threw herself into caring for her son, pouring into him all the tenderness she could no longer express elsewhere. Her days revolved around feeding, cleaning, rocking him to sleep, a relentless cycle that left her body drained and her spirit flickering weakly. Bobby drifted further away, his presence now more ghost than man, a figure that came and went without pattern or apology. The more Josephine tried to anchor their little family, the more reckless Bobby became. New rumors drifted into her ears, this time not just about late-night flings, but about him openly flaunting other women in clubs, buying them jewelry, taking them on weekend trips, while Josephine washed baby clothes by hand and listened to the walls creak in the heavy, lonely silence. Sometimes Bobby would stumble home late, reeking of perfume and arrogance, and bark at her for imagined offenses, a cold meal, a misplaced cloth, a crying child interrupting his drunken sleep. Josephine learned to bow her head lower, to tighten the corners of her mouth, to pretend she didn't hear the neighbors' whispers that followed her whenever she stepped outside to fetch water or buy bread. The years slipped by with cruel speed, and before Josephine could catch her breath, she was cradling a second child in her weary arms, then a third. Each pregnancy was met with less enthusiasm and more resentment, Bobby growing colder with each new mouth to feed. Josephine's body bore the marks of her sacrifices, tired eyes, worn hands, a back that ached constantly under the weight of thankless days. Yet Bobby treated her with a kind of casual cruelty that made it clear he saw her not as a partner, but as a possession, a background fixture to his reckless life. He no longer cared to hide his affairs. Women called at odd hours, their voices sharp and mocking. Sometimes Josephine would hear laughter from the living room when she was nursing a child in the bedroom, unfamiliar laughter, flirtatious and cruel, mocking the vows that once tied them together. Still, Josephine stayed, not out of love, but out of sheer exhaustion, trapped by the sheer weight of her reality and the tiny, innocent eyes that looked up at her, expecting a world she no longer knew how to provide. Somewhere deep inside, the last pieces of her dreams crumbled into dust, swallowed by the life Bobby had so effortlessly destroyed. The end came not with shouting or slammed doors, but with a hollow, emotionless sentence that hung in the air long after Bobby said it. One evening, while Josephine was preparing the children for bed, Bobby strolled into the house, carrying a faint smell of cologne that didn't belong to him. He leaned casually against the doorframe, arms folded, watching her with a look of detached boredom. "I'm tired," he said simply, his voice almost lazy. "Pack your things and leave. I want a new life." At first, Josephine thought she had misheard him. She paused, the baby's tiny shirt still clutched in her hand, blinking up at him as if waiting for a cruel punchline. But Bobby only shrugged and walked away, leaving the finality of his words ringing in the dim room. That night, Josephine sat on the floor between her sleeping children, feeling the old walls of Bobby's house, once a prison, now pushing her out like an intruder. There were no tears left to cry, only a slow, suffocating numbness as she packed their modest belongings into 2 worn-out bags, careful not to wake the children, who would soon be dragged into the uncertain darkness with her. At dawn, Josephine left the house that had once promised stability but delivered only sorrow. The early morning mist clung to the earth, veiling her as she walked down the cracked pavement with a baby strapped to her back, one child holding each of her hands. Her first thought was to return to her parents' home, to seek refuge in the place that had once been her sanctuary. But when she arrived, dusty and exhausted, her father's eyes hardened before she could even speak. Her mother stood behind him, wringing her hands in silent worry, but said nothing. "You made your choice," her father said coldly. "You will not bring shame into this house." Josephine stood there for a long moment, her heart breaking anew as the front door, once wide open to her, closed firmly in her face. She turned away slowly, the children tugging at her skirt, their small faces puzzled by the rejection they did not understand. Step by step, Josephine made her way back onto the lonely streets, carrying not just her children, but the heavy knowledge that she had been abandoned by everyone she once trusted to protect her. It was Adora who saved her from sleeping under the open sky. Without hesitation, her friend opened her tiny rented apartment, making space amidst the clutter for Josephine and her children. It was cramped, unbearably hot, and the mattress they shared sagged in the middle. But to Josephine, it felt like the safest place she had known in years. Nights were the hardest, when the children whimpered in their sleep, dreaming of homes they could not name, and Josephine lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, battling the rising tide of bitterness inside her. Meanwhile, news of Bobby's new life traveled fast. He had remarried a young, fashionable woman, and the town buzzed with stories of their lavish vacations, the expensive cars, the photos splashed across social media of sparkling beaches and luxury resorts. Josephine watched from the shadows, the glow of her phone screen illuminating her tear-streaked face. It was a cruel irony. Bobby had erased her like a stain, and the world had moved on without missing a beat. As she held her children tighter, Josephine realized that she was no longer fighting for love or for dreams. She was fighting for survival, hers and theirs, in a world that had long since stopped caring whether she won or lost. Everywhere Josephine turned, it seemed Bobby's new life shimmered like a cruel, taunting spectacle. In the market stalls, women whispered behind cupped hands, scrolling through glossy photos of Bobby and his new wife posing by infinity pools, dining under chandeliers, laughing in places Josephine had only ever seen on television. The once small and bitter world she inhabited now seemed invaded by constant reminders of all she had lost, or perhaps all she had never truly had. She heard of the new car he bought her replacement, a sleek machine that glided through town like a silver shark. She overheard tales of trips to Paris, to Dubai, of designer gowns worn to events where Josephine had never even been welcome. Each story stabbed at her ribs like a slow knife, carving deeper lines of bitterness into her soul. She wondered if the new woman knew the monster that Bobby hid behind polished smiles and expensive perfume, or if, like Josephine once had, she too was dazzled by gifts, while blind to the invisible cage, quietly snapping shut around her. In the quiet corners of Adora's tiny apartment, Josephine wrestled daily with a storm of emotions too tangled to name. There were moments when she blamed herself fiercely, replaying every decision that led her here. The first yes she whispered against her better judgment, the hopes she clung to even when reality screamed at her to run. Other times, anger gripped her so tightly she feared it might tear her apart. Anger at Bobby, at her parents, at a society that praised men for moving on while marking women like her with invisible scars they were expected to hide. But more than the anger, more than the shame, it was the grief that weighed most heavily on her, a grief not just for the life she had lost, but for the version of herself she no longer recognized. The Josephine who once walked campus paths with her books tucked under one arm and her dreams under the other had been swallowed whole by years of compromise, silence, and sorrow. Now she sat cross-legged on a threadbare mattress, combing lice from her daughter's hair with trembling hands, wondering when exactly she had begun to disappear. Still, somewhere beneath the wreckage of her spirit, a small stubborn ember refused to die. It flared dimly in moments she barely noticed, when she soothed her children's cries with soft songs, when she tied their shoelaces even though her own shoes were worn thin, when she smiled at Adora's terrible jokes just to remind herself she could still feel something other than regret. Josephine began to understand that survival wasn't always loud or victorious. Sometimes it was simply the act of getting up each day, choosing to breathe even when it hurt. In the darkest hours of the night, when the world outside had fallen silent and even the children's breathing softened into dreams, Josephine made herself a quiet promise. She would not let Bobby be the end of her story. She didn't know how yet, didn't know when or where or through what painful effort, but somewhere beyond the brokenness, she would find a way to stand again, not for love, not for pride, but for the three small hearts that now beat in rhythm with her own. The first steps toward reclaiming herself were not grand or visible to anyone but Josephine. They came quietly, on mornings when she forced herself to rise before the sun, bundling her children in second-hand clothes, and walking to a woman's stall at the far end of the market. The woman, a distant aunt of Adora's, sold peppers, onions, and spices, and needed an extra hand. Josephine, once too proud to imagine herself squatting by dusty baskets all day, now sat under the scalding heat without complaint, her fingers raw and stained red from the endless sorting and bagging. Every coin she earned, she folded carefully into a small, worn pouch, hidden deep in the mattress she shared with her children. It wasn't much, barely enough for a better meal, certainly not enough to call a new life, but it was a beginning. Each evening, when she trudged home with aching feet and a back bent from the long hours, Josephine would look at her children asleep in their corner of the room, their faces peaceful in ways she hadn't seen for years, and remind herself why she could not afford to collapse again. The world outside moved on, uninterested in her struggle. People who had once celebrated Bobby's wealth barely glanced at Josephine anymore, as though poverty rendered her invisible. Occasionally, she would catch fragments of gossip, another vacation Bobby had taken, another party thrown for his new wife, their smiling faces appearing once in a glossy magazine a neighbor left behind. But these stories no longer pierced her heart the way they once did. Josephine learned to turn her focus inward, to the tiny victories only she could measure. A full pot of stew simmering on Adora's stove, her son learning to read words from an old torn book she found at the roadside, her youngest daughter giggling uncontrollably over a silly song Josephine made up. Life was still hard, unbearably so. But in the small, overlooked spaces of each day, Josephine began stitching herself back together. She was not healed. Some wounds would always ache, but she was no longer broken beyond repair. Bit by bit, she gathered the fragments of her soul and dared to believe that even ashes could be shaped into something new. One evening, long after the market had emptied and the world around them had fallen into a soft, dusty twilight, Josephine sat outside the small room she shared with Adora, her legs stretched out on the cracked cement floor. She watched the children chasing each other barefoot in the yard, their laughter rising like a hymn against the settling darkness. For the first time in years, Josephine allowed herself to breathe without feeling like she owed the world an apology. She didn't have wealth or a grand home or the life she once dreamed of building with the wrong man. But she had her freedom, hard-won and precious. She had the fierce, unbreakable love of her children. And most importantly, she had herself, bruised, wiser, stronger. As she tilted her head back and let the evening breeze brush against her tired face, Josephine closed her eyes and whispered a silent vow into the wind. This is not where my story ends. No, her story was only just beginning, and this time she would be the one writing it, page by determined page. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.